Margaret stood frozen on the cold concrete of the parking lot, watching as Kathy and Derek walked toward the car without a second glance. The bustling city had always felt alive with possibilities, but today it felt suffocating. They had all come to New York together, a brief trip, just the three of them. But now Margaret felt the weight of her years of giving, of putting everyone's needs before her own, pressing down on her. "Wait here, Mom," Kathy's voice rang out over her shoulder, dismissive, as she dialed a number on her phone. Derek didn't even look at her as he followed Kathy, his steps quick and deliberate. Margaret blinked, the words echoing in her mind. "Wait here." She was the afterthought, the burden, the invisible presence in their busy lives. No apology, no thank you for everything she had done over the years. Just a cold command to wait, as if she didn't have a life of her own. The wind brushed against her skin, biting at her. But it was the realization that stung the most. She wasn't just ignored. She was taken for granted, and somewhere along the way, she had let it happen. She had let Kathy and Derek use her, believing that's what a mother was supposed to do. Give, give, give. Margaret watched as the two of them reached the car. Kathy laughed at something Derek had said, her voice carrying in the wind, but the sound felt hollow. Margaret's stomach twisted. She had spent years putting up with their dismissive remarks, their entitlement, their ever-increasing demands, never once asking for anything in return. And now, as they walked away, she understood. This was how they saw her. She had been a tool, a safety net, nothing more. Her chest tightened. The familiar sting of abandonment settled deep inside, but this time it was different. She wasn't angry. No, it wasn't anger. It was something else, something deeper, a quiet, sharp sense of clarity. Kathy and Derek could walk away. They could leave her stranded in this parking lot, but it didn't matter anymore. Margaret turned away from the car and reached into her bag for her phone. She wasn't going to call them. No. She wasn't going to beg. Instead, she dialed a number that meant something. Lori, her friend, the one who had always seen her for who she truly was. She pressed the phone to her ear, her heart pounding in her chest. As the call rang, she watched the couple drive away, disappearing into the traffic of the city. They didn't even look back. The line clicked, and Lori's familiar voice came through. "Hey, Margaret, what's up?" Margaret swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. She didn't want to cry. "I need a place to stay." There was a pause on the other end. "Of course. You're welcome here, anytime." Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of the words settle in. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't going to let them dictate her life. And as the taxi pulled up, Margaret climbed in, her decision already made. This was the beginning of something new. The taxi ride home was a blur, the city lights flickering past the window like a series of forgotten dreams. Margaret sat in silence, her fingers wrapped tightly around her purse, clutching it as though it were her only anchor in this sea of overwhelming emotions. The car's hum barely registered. Her mind was far away, caught in a web of memories, of years spent trying to please Kathy and Derek, of always putting them first, even when she was never asked to. She should have called them, should have demanded an explanation, maybe even a tearful apology for the way they'd abandoned her. But Margaret's hands didn't reach for her phone. She didn't call Kathy or Derek. The thought of hearing their voices, the hollow words of feigned concern or guilt, made her stomach turn. The truth was too clear now. They didn't care. Not in the way she had hoped, not in the way she had given herself to them all these years. Instead, she pulled out her phone and texted Lori. "I'm okay, but I need to stay with you for a while. It's time to make some changes. Can I come over?" She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Her heart raced with the weight of her decision. The woman who had been her best friend for over 30 years, who knew everything about her, who had seen her at her best and worst, would be her refuge now. The car slowed, pulling into the familiar suburban neighborhood that had once been her comfort, her sanctuary. The streets were lined with neat houses, their lights warm against the cool evening. Margaret stared out the window as they passed her house, the one she had shared with Kathy when she was a little girl, the one she had kept as a safe haven for them all. Her eyes lingered on the front door, the porch light flickering. She had lived here for decades, but not anymore. The cab stopped in front of her house and she paid the driver, her mind still spinning. She sat there for a moment, gathering her thoughts. This wasn't just about the parking lot incident. It was about everything that had led up to it. The constant feeling of being unseen, of being overlooked. She had given so much. And for what? To be tossed aside like an old coat that no longer served a purpose? Margaret stepped out of the car and walked toward the door, her shoes tapping softly against the concrete. She didn't bother unlocking the door. It was open, as it always had been. Kathy, Derek. They didn't care to see if she was home. They had never checked. She closed the door behind her with a soft click, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Margaret stood alone in the quiet of her house. She allowed herself a moment to breathe, to take in the emptiness. The house wasn't the same anymore. It didn't feel like home, not with the shadows of their neglect still hanging over it. Pulling her phone from her pocket, she saw the reply from Lori. Of course, anytime. You know that. A wave of relief washed over her. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. But there was no going back to the way things had been. Margaret's eyes traveled around the room, her mind already turning, already planning. She didn't need them. She had always thought she did. Always convinced herself that she was the one who had to make things right, to keep the peace. But peace wasn't found in sacrifice. Peace was found in the freedom to live on her own terms. She stepped toward the window, gazing out into the night. The stars, faint and distant, seemed to echo the quiet uncertainty she felt inside. But even in the uncertainty, something else stirred, a sense of purpose. No more being a safety net, no more giving when she had nothing left to offer. The weight of the years lifted slightly, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt the smallest spark of hope. She was done being invisible, and the road ahead, she would walk it alone. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing in on her. The phone in her hand felt heavier than it should, her fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the screen. She'd never done anything like this before, never chosen herself over others. But today, everything had changed. She couldn't keep living in the shadows of Kathy and Derek's demands, always the giver, never the receiver. She needed to reclaim her life. The cursor hovered over the penthouse listings on the screen, a penthouse suite in New York City. It was more than just a room, it was an escape. It was a chance to live without the weight of other people's expectations. Her breath caught in her throat. Could she really do this? Could she justify something so extravagant when she'd spent her entire life giving everything she had to others? She thought back to the years of sacrifice, of always putting Kathy and Derek's needs before her own. They had treated her like an afterthought, and today, when they had left her standing in that parking lot, she realized it was time to stop. Time to stop being the one who was always there to catch them when they fell. With a deep breath, Margaret clicked on the listing, her heart racing. She entered her details, her fingers shaking just slightly as she finalized the booking. The confirmation screen popped up, and Margaret exhaled in a rush. She had done it. She had booked a penthouse. For herself. For the first time in her life, she was choosing her happiness over everyone else's, and it felt terrifying. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Lori. "Hey, Margaret, how's everything going?" Lori's voice was a comforting balm after the whirlwind of emotions Margaret had been navigating all day. "I did it," Margaret said softly, still processing the reality of her decision. "I booked a penthouse in New York, just for me." Lori's delighted laugh echoed through the phone. "I knew you would. "You deserve this, Margaret. This is your time." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the relief to wash over her. "It feels strange, though, like I'm doing something selfish." "No," Lori said firmly. "You're doing something brave. You've given so much of yourself for everyone else. This is for you. It's time to take back your life." Margaret smiled, her chest loosening with each of Lori's words. "I think you're right." She walked over to the window and gazed out at the quiet neighborhood. The city lights were a distant shimmer, but for the first time, the distance felt like an invitation. The idea of waking up in a penthouse, free from the shadows of her past life, filled her with both fear and excitement. This was her moment. The road ahead was uncertain, but she was no longer afraid to walk it alone. Margaret was ready for the next chapter of her life, and it would start with this first bold step into the unknown. Margaret stepped out of the elevator and into the penthouse, her breath catching as she took in the expansive space. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows was nothing short of breathtaking, a panoramic sweep of the city, glowing with the golden hues of the setting sun. The soft hum of the city below seemed distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. The decor was elegant but minimal, sophisticated without being ostentatious. Soft blues and warm neutrals dominated the room, creating a sense of calm. Margaret let her fingers trail along the smooth, polished surface of a glass coffee table as she walked further into the room. She had never stayed in a place like this before, and it felt both exhilarating and unnerving. A man in a sharp suit approached her, introducing himself as Reed, the hotel manager. His smile was warm but professional. "If you need anything, Ms. Thompson, don't hesitate to let us know. I'll leave you to settle in." Margaret nodded, offering a tight smile in return. Reed's presence, so calm and assured, only highlighted how out of place she felt. For the first time in her life, everything was completely hers, no obligations, no expectations, and yet it felt like an unfamiliar weight on her shoulders. As Reed left, Margaret wandered to the window, gazing at the city below. The realization hit her slowly. She had made it. She was finally free of the constant demands of Kathy and Derek. No longer would she be the safety net, the one who always gave without asking for anything in return. She felt the stirrings of something new, something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. After a few minutes, Margaret moved away from the window and walked around the penthouse. The space was vast, almost too large for her. She had always lived in cozy, more intimate places. This open expanse, though beautiful, felt a bit cold, and she longed for the comfort of her own familiar chaos. She sat down on a plush armchair and reached for a journal from the coffee table. She hadn't written in ages, but tonight it seemed like the right thing to do. She opened the journal, staring at the blank page for a long moment, unsure of where to start. Her life had been a blur of caregiving, compromise, and self-sacrifice. Now, it was hers to shape. Margaret picked up the pen and began writing. "For the first time, I'm living for me." The thought felt foreign and thrilling all at once. She had no idea where this new journey would take her, but she was determined to make the most of it. The uncertainty no longer felt like a threat. It was a promise of something different, something entirely her own. Later, she decided to take a walk. The crisp evening air was refreshing, and as she strolled through the city streets, her anxiety began to ebb away. The world around her was alive, but she felt as though she had finally found her place in it. No more distractions, no more expectations, just her, walking toward an unknown future. This was the beginning of something new, and Margaret couldn't wait to see where it led. The soft hum of the lawyer's office was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling inside Margaret. She sat across from the polished desk, the weight of the decision she had made settling heavier with every passing second. The room was lined with bookshelves filled with legal texts, and the smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. Yet all Margaret could focus on was the man sitting opposite her. his pen poised over a document she had yet to sign. "Ms. Thompson, I have to admit, I'm surprised by the changes you're requesting," the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses. He cleared his throat, then continued in a more measured tone. "It's certainly within your rights, of course, but excluding your daughter and son-in-law from your will is unusual. I just want to be sure you're certain about this." Margaret looked at him, feeling a quiet sense of resolve settle over her. This was her decision, and for the first time in years, she felt confident in it. "I'm certain," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've spent too many years supporting Kathy and Derek, giving them everything I had. They've never appreciated it. In fact, I've only ever been a tool for their own comfort, their own agendas." The lawyer nodded, making a note on the paper in front of him. Margaret could see the slight hesitation in his eyes, the doubt. He wasn't used to this kind of request, especially when it came from a family dynamic as complicated as hers. But it didn't matter. She wasn't asking for his approval. She was reclaiming her life. "I want my legacy to reflect my values," Margaret continued, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair, grounding herself. "I want to leave something that can make a difference, something that will empower women, help those who've been left behind, like I've been. I'm setting up a charity for women's rights and empowerment. I've seen too many women live their lives in the shadows of others. I want to change that." The lawyer paused, studying her face. Margaret could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had likely expected her to give some parting gesture to Kathy and Derek, some token of family connection, but there was no room for that now. "I can help you ensure that your wishes are legally binding," he said after a beat. "This will need to be handled carefully to avoid any challenges down the line." Margaret nodded. She had thought this through carefully, considering every angle. She wasn't doing this out of spite. She was doing it out of self-preservation. The legacy she left behind would be hers to control. No more manipulation, no more guilt. After a few minutes of finalizing the details, the lawyer handed her a set of documents to sign. Margaret looked over the papers one last time, the weight of the moment settling in. She signed each page with a steady hand, her heart pounding in her chest. When she finished, she looked up at him and exhaled. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, then closed the folder, locking it away. "I'll have everything filed and processed. Your estate will be in good hands." As Margaret left the office, the world outside seemed quieter somehow, as though a burden she hadn't even known she was carrying had finally been lifted. For so many years, she had thought her worth was tied to her family, her daughter, her son-in-law. But now, she realized she was worth more than that. She had value beyond what she could give them, and she would make sure that value lived on after her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her back to reality. She glanced at it, seeing Kathy's name flashing on the screen. She had already ignored several calls from her daughter over the past few days. She was starting to tire of the constant demands and guilt trips that never seemed to end. The phone buzzed again, and then again. Kathy wasn't giving up. Margaret didn't pick up. Instead, she powered off the phone and stuffed it back into her bag. She needed space. She needed distance. And for the first time, she didn't feel guilty about it. Her legacy was no longer about appeasing Kathy's endless demands or Derek's ambitions. It was about something bigger, something that mattered. As she walked down the street, the sun beginning to dip behind the horizon, she felt a sense of closure that had been a long time coming. She had redefined her future. And there was no turning back now. The cafe buzzed with laughter and chatter as Margaret stepped inside, the familiar warmth of the space enveloping her like a long-lost embrace. It had been too long since she'd allowed herself moments like this, simple, real conversations with people who cared. Lori was already waiting for her at a corner booth, a wide smile spreading across her face as she waved. "Margaret!" Lori called out, her voice filled with genuine excitement. "I'm so glad you could make it." Margaret smiled, her heart easing with every step closer. "It's been too long," she replied, slipping into the booth. "I wasn't sure I remembered how to just be here." Lori's eyes softened, and she reached out to squeeze Margaret's hand. "You don't have to remember anything. You're here now. That's all that matters." The warmth of Lori's support grounded Margaret in the moment. This wasn't like the cold, transactional relationships she'd endured with Kathy and Derek. These were people who genuinely cared for her, who hadn't taken her for granted. She looked around at the familiar faces, old friends, shared memories, and realized just how much she had missed this feeling. As they caught up, Margaret found herself talking about the decision she'd made. She shared how she had severed ties with Kathy and Derek, how she had finally decided to change her will and estate plan. She felt no shame in saying it aloud, only a quiet pride. "I've given so much to them over the years," Margaret explained, her voice steady. "And in the end, I was just a tool for them to use. I realized I need to focus on myself now, on things that really matter." Lori nodded, her expression a mix of understanding and validation. "You've done the right thing, Margaret. And you've spent so much of your life keeping them comfortable, but now it's time to keep you comfortable. It's not selfish, it's survival." Margaret felt a rush of relief at Lori's words. She'd been second-guessing herself for days, wondering if she'd made the right call. But hearing Lori's support helped to solidify it. She'd finally taken control of her life. As the conversation shifted, Lori leaned in with a mischievous smile. "You know, you've always talked about wanting to travel, see the world. How about we make that happen? A trip abroad, just the two of us. We could go to Europe, Paris, Rome, Barcelona." Margaret's heart fluttered with the thought. She'd always put her own dreams on hold, always made sacrifices for others. But now, the idea of living for herself felt like a thrilling possibility. She smiled, the excitement bubbling up inside her. "I'm in," she said with newfound confidence. "Let's do it. Let's make it happen." Lori's grin widened, and she raised her coffee cup in a mock toast. "To new beginnings," she said. Margaret clinked her cup against Lori's, her heart lighter than it had been in years. This wasn't just a trip. It was a declaration, a promise to herself that her life would no longer be defined by the needs of others. It was her time now, and the world was full of possibilities. As they continued to talk, Margaret's mind raced with excitement. For the first time, she was beginning to feel the freedom she had long been searching for. But a small part of her still wondered. What would Kathy and Derek think when they found out? But as the thought passed, Margaret smiled. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had finally found her own path, and it was everything she'd ever dreamed of. Margaret stood in front of her mirror, studying the reflection that stared back at her. The woman in the glass was different from the one she had seen for years, stronger, more confident, but also softer, more open. She had shed the layers of guilt, of self-doubt, and now what was left was someone who finally knew her own worth. The room behind her was calm, filled with the hum of distant traffic. Her new apartment, a temporary haven while she explored what came next, was a far cry from the house where she had spent decades trying to keep the peace, always defined by her role as Kathy's mother. But now, it felt different. She wasn't just someone's mother anymore. She was Margaret. She was her own person, standing on her own feet, independent and free. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, snapping her out of her reverie. She glanced at the screen, expecting to see another email or maybe a notification about her new charity project. Instead, it was Kathy's name flashing on the display. She hesitated. The last time they spoke, no, the last time Kathy had demanded her attention, Margaret had cut the ties. She wasn't ready to pick up, but the curiosity tugged at her. She tapped the screen, her thumb hovering before finally accepting the call. "Hi, Mom." Kathy's voice came through, tentative. There was an unfamiliar note of vulnerability in it that Margaret hadn't heard before. "Kathy," Margaret said, her tone measured but not cold. "What's going on?" I've been thinking." Kathy began, the words coming slowly as though rehearsed. "I'm sorry. I know I haven't been the best daughter, or the best person for that matter." There was a long pause before she continued, the weight of her words settling in. "I've taken you for granted, and I want you to know that I'm sorry for how I treated you." Margaret stood still, the phone pressed to her ear. The apology wasn't what she had expected, but it didn't matter. She wasn't sure if Kathy was truly sorry for her behavior, or just trying to regain control over a situation that had slipped from her grasp. Either way, Margaret had changed, and Kathy's apology, however sincere, couldn't undo the years of neglect and manipulation. "I appreciate you saying that, Kathy," Margaret said quietly. "But I'm not the person I used to be. I've changed, and I'm no longer going to be the person you turn to when it's convenient for you." Kathy's breath caught on the other end, a sharp intake of air that felt almost like a plea. "I get it," she whispered. "I really do. I don't know how to fix things between us. I want to, but I'm afraid." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. This was what she had wanted, right? Her daughter acknowledging her mistakes, but it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt distant. The years of resentment, of unspoken tension, seemed too large to bridge in a single conversation. She had already moved past it. "Kathy, I'm not angry anymore," Margaret said, her voice steady. "But I've learned that I need to live for myself. I can't keep holding on to something that wasn't healthy for me." The silence that followed hung heavy, and then Kathy spoke again, her voice smaller, more vulnerable than Margaret had ever heard it. "I understand, Mom. I really do. Can we try to be better? Not for me, but for you?" Margaret felt her chest tighten. She didn't know what the future held for her and Kathy, if there was any future at all. But right now, she realized she wasn't just making room for her own happiness. She was making room for something else entirely, a future without the need for validation from her daughter. It was empowering. "I'm doing what's best for me now, Kathy, and I hope one day you can understand that." As she ended the call, Margaret stared at the screen for a long moment, her mind racing. She had redefined her role, her identity, and Kathy's apology, while sincere, was just one chapter in a book that Margaret had finally taken control of. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Lori. "So, about that trip to Paris. Let's make it happen. The world is waiting for us." Margaret smiled as she typed her response, the words flowing easily now. "Let's go." For the first time, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't waiting for someone else to make her happy. She was moving forward, no longer tethered to the past. The world was hers to discover, and she was ready. Margaret leaned back in her chair, the city stretching before her in a sprawling grid of lights and motion. The view from her new office was everything she'd imagined, and more. The room felt alive with possibility, yet there was a calmness to it, a steady pulse of quiet ambition. This was her space, her future, and for the first time, she wasn't simply surviving. It felt like she was thriving. Her new business venture, a consulting firm dedicated to empowering women in business, had finally launched, and already she was seeing the impact. It was everything she had dreamed of while stuck in the rut of family expectations. The team was small for now, but she could feel the energy building. Sarah, her first hire, was brilliant, a sharp, ambitious woman who reminded Margaret of herself when she had first started out. It was a joy to watch her bring fresh ideas and energy into the company. Margaret had started this business not just to make a living, but to make a difference. She had always been the one who sacrificed, who gave and gave without asking for anything in return. Now she was demanding more for herself, for her future, and for the women she was helping. As the day went on, Margaret dove deeper into planning her next moves: client outreach, networking, building her brand. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Kathy again. Margaret hesitated, the old reflex of guilt threatening to rise. She'd already decided, but part of her still ached with the pull of family ties, the old sense of responsibility. But the voice inside her was clear. She had built this life for herself, and it was time to protect it. She glanced at the screen and let the call go to voicemail. The decision felt freeing, like a weight lifting off her shoulders. She had already heard the apologies, and while they were nice, they didn't change the reality. She had done the right thing. Kathy had made her choices, and now Margaret had to make hers. The phone buzzed again, but this time Margaret didn't even check. Instead, she moved forward with her work, her focus clear. She didn't need Kathy's approval anymore. She didn't need anyone's approval. As the afternoon faded into evening, she looked at the team around her, Sarah, a few contractors, and herself, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. No longer defined by her role as Kathy's mother, she'd become someone who mattered on her own terms. Her new life was unfolding in front of her, and Margaret embraced it with both hands. The freedom to shape her own future, to build something meaningful, felt like the most powerful choice she had ever made, and she wasn't looking back. The idea had been in her mind for weeks, a solo vacation, Europe. It felt like the kind of freedom Margaret had only ever dreamed of, until now. She had spent so many years being the one to make sacrifices, the one who stayed behind, the one who bent herself out of shape to fit into other people's lives. This time, there were no compromises, no obligations, just her. She booked the flight to Athens without a second thought, the thrill of independence swirling within her like a breath of fresh air. The days leading up to her departure were filled with a mix of excitement and nerves. Margaret had always been the one to organize, to take care of the details. But this time, she was the one simply showing up, free to experience the world on her own terms. She packed lightly, just enough for herself, nothing more, and the weight of the suitcases felt lighter than they had any right to be. She was finally shedding the weight of others' expectations, and the sense of freedom was almost intoxicating. Arriving in Athens felt like stepping into a dream. The heat of the Mediterranean sun kissed her skin as she stepped out into the cobbled streets, the ancient city around her full of stories and whispers of the past. The air was rich with the scent of olive trees, and the vibrancy of life filled every corner of the city. Margaret wandered through the ancient ruins, feeling more alive than she had in years. She was no longer someone's caretaker, someone's emotional support. She was simply Margaret, a woman who could wander freely, her own person with her own desires. Each day was a new adventure. She explored the Acropolis, marveling at the towering columns that had withstood the test of time. She wandered through narrow streets, sipping espresso at cafes, savoring every moment. But it was on a quiet beach in Greece, miles from the bustle of the city, that Margaret had the most profound moment of self-realization. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the calm waters. The beach was nearly empty, save for a few travelers scattered along the shoreline. Margaret had found a quiet spot, the sound of the waves lapping against the shore the only noise around her. She closed her eyes, feeling the sun on her skin, the breeze in her hair, and a deep sense of contentment that filled her from the inside out. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. No one was pulling at her. No one was asking her to be something she wasn't. She was exactly where she needed to be. As the warmth of the day began to fade into twilight, she reflected on everything she had left behind, the expectations, the guilt, the emotional burden of always being there for Kathy and Derek. They had taken so much from her, but in doing so, they had unknowingly pushed her towards something greater. They had shown her how badly she needed this time for herself, this chance to rediscover who she was outside of her role as their mother. It was a gift, one that was hers alone. Her phone buzzed in her bag, snapping her from her thoughts. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled it out. Kathy's name flashed across the screen, followed by several missed calls and a message. "Mom, I don't understand why you're acting this way. Why won't you let us in? Please talk to me. I need you." Margaret stared at the message for a long moment. The words felt familiar, but they no longer held the weight they once did. There was a time when she would have responded immediately, trying to soothe Kathy's hurt or guilt. But now, as she sat on the edge of the sea, a sense of calm washed over her. She let out a small laugh, not in mockery, but in pure, quiet realization. The woman who had always been there for everyone else, the woman who had bent and broken for others, had finally found her own freedom. Kathy's demands, her neediness, were just echoes of a past Margaret was no longer tied to. With a deep breath, she turned her phone off and slipped it back into her bag. She didn't need to explain herself anymore. She didn't need to fix anything. She was free to choose her own path. And that was all that mattered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret sat back, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to a deep, serene blue. The world around her was vast, full of possibilities, and for the first time in a long time, she was ready to embrace it all. Margaret sat on the small balcony of her apartment, a cup of tea in her hands, the world sprawled before her like a vast, untold story. The city buzzed with its usual energy, but from where she sat, it felt distant, like a world she was no longer part of. She had spent so many years entangled in the lives of Kathy and Derek, tethered to their needs, their demands. But now, sitting in the quiet of her own space, she finally understood the magnitude of the decision she had made. The weight of the past still lingered, though. It wasn't gone entirely. And just as she was letting the peace of the moment wash over her, her phone buzzed. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the number. It was Kathy. She stared at the screen, the old reflex of guilt creeping up again. For a moment, she was tempted to pick up. Maybe Kathy had changed her mind. Maybe now they could fix things. But Margaret knew better now. She had already heard Kathy's apologies, felt the pull of her daughter's emotional manipulation. It wasn't enough. Not anymore. But then, as if on cue, another message appeared. Margaret's thumb hovered over the screen. She knew it would be more of the same, but this time, the message felt different. More urgent, more accusing. "Mom, how could you do this? You've abandoned your family. After everything we've been through, you just walk away. I don't understand how you could leave us when we need you the most. You're destroying everything. Please, I need you." The words hit hard, but not in the way they once would have. Once, Margaret would have folded, would have felt the sharp stab of guilt in her chest, rushing to fix things, to make sure her daughter didn't feel alone. But now, the weight of the words felt lighter, almost insignificant. She read the message once more, not with the crushing guilt of the past, but with an understanding that came from living through it, from realizing that she had always been the one holding the pieces together while they took, without ever giving back. Her fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to reply, to tell Kathy that she wasn't abandoning anyone, but the thought passed as quickly as it came. Margaret wasn't going to explain herself anymore. The years of emotional labor, of sacrificing her own happiness for others, were behind her now. She didn't owe anyone that anymore. Margaret set the phone down, the message still lingering in her mind, but not in a way that held her captive. She felt the burden of it lift slowly, like she was shedding skin that no longer fit. She could breathe easier now. She could finally be free. As if the universe had answered her unspoken desire for peace, Lori appeared at the door with a bright smile, her arms open. "I missed you," she said, as Margaret stood and embraced her, a feeling of warmth and connection washing over her. "I missed you too," Margaret replied, the words carrying more meaning than she had expected. Lori stepped back, taking in the room with an approving glance. "Look at you, Margaret. You've done it. You're living for yourself." Margaret smiled, feeling a quiet pride in those words. "I never realized how much I was carrying around. The guilt, the weight of always trying to please them." Lori nodded, her expression soft with understanding. "You've carried it for long enough, but now you've let it go, and you're stronger for it." Margaret felt her throat tighten, but this time it wasn't from sorrow. It was from a strange, newfound clarity. She was no longer tethered to the past, no longer weighed down by the responsibilities she had taken on without question. She was free, and that freedom was something she could finally understand. As they sat together, sharing stories and laughter, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She was finally living for herself, surrounded by people who valued her for who she truly was, not for what she could give. The phone buzzed again. Margaret glanced at it. It was another message from Kathy. This time, she didn't even flinch. She picked up the phone, deleted the message, and set it back down. There was no turning back now. She had done the work, and the weight of the past was fading with each passing day. Margaret had learned to live for herself, and no one could take that away from her. Margaret sat at her desk, the soft hum of the city drifting through the window. She had finally found a rhythm, a quiet confidence in the life she had built. Her business was thriving. Clients were reaching out. Partnerships were being formed, and every morning she woke up excited to go to work. It felt surreal, but in the best possible way. She had spent so many years living for everyone else, but now, this success, this independence, was all her own. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. Margaret glanced at the screen. It was Kathy again. Her heart sank, but only briefly. The reflex to respond, to make everything right, was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She took a breath and let the call go to voicemail as she had so many times before. She opened the message from Kathy. "Mom, I don't know what to say. I'm sorry for everything. I've been selfish and thoughtless. Please, let's fix this. I need you." Margaret's fingers hovered over the phone, tempted to respond, but instead she set it down. For years, she had carried the weight of their relationship, the guilt, the demands, always bending to their will. But now, she had finally learned how to let go. She picked up a pen, crossing off the last line of the to-do list she had written that morning. It felt good, too good. Margaret had built something real here, something that was her own, and for the first time, she didn't need Kathy or Derek to validate it. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't Kathy. It was Lori. "You're not going to believe this. There's a gala next month, honoring top women in business. They want to feature you. We're going, right?" Margaret smiled, feeling a swell of gratitude. Lori had always been her anchor. "You've earned it," Lori had said once, and Margaret had taken those words to heart. She had earned this, every bit of it. The gala was only a few weeks away, but already the idea of standing in front of that crowd filled her with excitement rather than dread. She hadn't realized how much she needed this moment of recognition. For too long, she had been invisible, defined by her roles as a mother, a caretaker. But now, she was Margaret. She was more than that. She was a force in her own right. The day of the event arrived, and Margaret stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the deep green dress that made her feel more herself than anything she'd ever worn. She was ready. As she entered the gala, the lights flashing, people congratulating her, she felt something shift deep within. This was it. The life she had built, the independence she had fought for, was no longer a dream. It was her reality. Standing on stage, accepting her award, Margaret realized that her new life was just beginning. She was no longer the woman who bent to others' expectations. She was the woman who defined her own path. And this was only the start. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Margaret sat on her balcony, a cup of tea in her hands, the world below moving with its usual rhythm. But inside her, there was peace, a stillness that had been absent for so long. She had carved this life for herself, brick by brick, and now, for the first time in years, she could simply breathe. No guilt, no obligations, just her. And it felt like everything she had ever wanted. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A message, Kathy. Margaret's heart didn't skip a beat, no longer tethered by the reflex to respond. She glanced at the screen, seeing the familiar name, the words already forming in her mind. The apology, the blame, the guilt. You've ruined everything. There it was, the message she had expected, the one that carried the familiar sting, the last remnants of the control Kathy still tried to exert over her. Margaret read the words slowly, but they no longer held any power. Not anymore. The weight of the years spent trying to fix things, trying to make Kathy feel seen, heard, validated. It was all gone. She had given until there was nothing left to offer, and now, at last, she was free. Margaret set the phone down without responding, feeling only a quiet release. She could have spent hours debating whether to reply, trying to explain herself again, but she didn't need to. She'd already said everything she needed to say with her actions, with the choices she had made. She wasn't going back. She wasn't going to carry that burden anymore. Instead, she closed her eyes, letting the peace fill her. It was a peace born from taking control of her life, from shedding the weight of others' expectations, and finally embracing who she was. She had spent so long trying to make things work for others, but now she was living for herself, and it felt like freedom. She smiled to herself, the kind of smile that came from deep within, unburdened by the past. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Margaret thought of everything she had accomplished. Her business was flourishing. She had built something real, something that was hers. She had surrounded herself with people who saw her for who she was, not as someone's mother or caretaker, but as a woman worthy of her own dreams. Her future was bright, full of possibilities, and for the first time, she was excited to see where it would take her. The following weeks were a blur of new experiences, new connections, and new adventures. Margaret finally visited the places she had always dreamed of seeing. Paris, Rome, Barcelona. Each city filled her with awe, not just for the beauty of the landscapes, but for the way they mirrored her own journey. She felt like a part of something bigger, something she had once felt disconnected from, but now embraced fully. In Paris, she walked along the Seine, the city of light glowing around her like a dream she had never thought she could touch. She laughed with Laurie over coffee in Rome, savoring the moments of friendship and joy. She stood in awe of the art and history in Barcelona, feeling like every step she took was a step toward her own personal rebirth. And through it all, she knew one thing. This life was hers. She had earned it, and no one could take it from her. One evening, as she sat in a cafe overlooking the sparkling Mediterranean, Margaret pulled out her phone and looked at the latest update on her business. Profits were up, her reach was expanding, and the work she was doing for women's empowerment was starting to make a real difference. She thought about how far she had come, how much she had grown, and she knew it was time for the next step. She made the decision then, in that moment of perfect clarity. She would donate a portion of her profits to causes close to her heart, charities focused on empowering women, those who had been left behind like she had once been. It was her way of giving back, of turning the freedom she had fought for into something that would help others reclaim theirs. As she looked out over the waves, the sun sinking below the horizon, Margaret felt something deep within her stir, a sense of peace and purpose that was more profound than anything she had known before. She was no longer burdened by guilt. She was no longer defined by others' needs. She was Margaret, fully herself, living her truth. And for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The future was wide open, and she was ready. The grand ballroom was filled with the clink of champagne glasses and soft chatter as Margaret stood at the edge of the stage, looking out over the crowd. The lights were blinding, but it didn't matter. She had spent years fading into the background, giving up her own dreams for the sake of others. Now, standing here, as the recipient of an award for her work in women's empowerment, she felt something new, a sense of strength and peace she had never known. Lori stood beside her, her face glowing with pride. "You've come so far, Margaret," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You're finally where you belong." Margaret gave her friend a smile, one full of gratitude and quiet confidence. She was no longer the woman who had spent years trying to please everyone else. She had found her own voice, her own path, and tonight it was all coming together. The event was a celebration of women who had fought through adversity to make a difference, women who had refused to be silenced. Margaret was one of them now, and the thought was both humbling and empowering. The presenter stepped up to the podium, announcing her name, and the room broke into applause. Margaret's legs felt like jelly as she made her way to the stage, but the familiar flutter in her chest was gone. This time, it wasn't fear. It was pride. "Margaret Thompson," the presenter said, handing her the award, "for your tireless work in empowering women to reclaim their voices and their futures." The applause was deafening, but Margaret's thoughts were clear. She didn't hear the noise. She didn't hear the praise. She heard her own heartbeat, steady and strong. For the first time in her life, she was standing up for herself, not for Kathy, not for Derek, not for anyone else. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady as she looked out at the crowd, ready to speak her truth. "Thank you," she began, the words flowing effortlessly. "When I started this journey, I never could have imagined where it would take me. I thought that if I just gave enough of myself, if I sacrificed enough, everything would fall into place. But what I didn't realize was that I was losing myself along the way." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in. The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. "I spent so many years living for others, trying to fix things, trying to be everything to everyone," she continued. "But in doing so, I lost sight of who I was. I let guilt, fear, and other people's expectations define me. And for a long time, I didn't know how to break free." Margaret's eyes scanned the crowd, her gaze landing on familiar faces, faces that had once been part of her past. Kathy and Derek were seated near the back, their eyes locked on her, expressions unreadable. "But I did break free," Margaret said, the words ringing with a newfound confidence. "I found my own voice. I chose myself. I chose freedom, not just for me, but for every woman who has ever felt like she was defined by the needs of others." She felt a surge of emotion, a deep sense of accomplishment rising in her chest. This was her moment, not for Kathy, not for Derek, but for her. "I acknowledge the pain I've been through. I acknowledge the sacrifices I made. But I will no longer carry the weight of someone else's expectations. I am no longer just surviving," she said, her voice rising. "I am thriving." The applause that followed felt different now, warm, genuine. Margaret could feel the shift in the room. She wasn't just speaking to them, she was speaking to herself, to the woman she had become. But then, a voice from the back of the room interrupted her, cutting through the applause. "Margaret," Kathy's voice rang out, shaky but loud enough for the room to hear. "You've gone too far. You can't just walk away from us. You're destroying our family. Don't you see that?" The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward Kathy, who was standing, her face flushed with emotion. Derek stood beside her, arms crossed, his expression tight with frustration. Margaret felt the old pull, the old instinct to apologize, to explain. But this time, the impulse faded quickly. She was no longer that woman. She wasn't going to let Kathy's need for control define her. Not now, not ever again. She lifted her chin, her voice calm but unwavering as she addressed the interruption. "Kathy," she said, her tone steady, "I've heard those words before. The guilt, the blame. But it's not mine to carry anymore. I am not destroying anything. I am living for myself, for the first time in years." Kathy's face twisted with frustration. But Margaret didn't look away. She wasn't going to let Kathy drag her back into that toxic space. She had broken free, and she would not be pulled down again. With a final, lingering glance at the couple, Margaret turned back to the audience, her heart pounding but her resolve stronger than ever. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and she had never felt more alive. As the applause thundered around her, Margaret knew this was just the beginning. Her rebirth had begun, and nothing, not even Kathy's guilt, could take that away. The crisp morning air filled the room as Margaret sat at her desk, her fingers poised over a new contract, one that would propel her business to heights she had once only dreamed of. The ink on the paper felt heavier than usual, the weight of this deal carrying more than just financial gain. This was the culmination of everything she had worked for, everything she had fought through. It wasn't just a business venture. It was the symbol of her independence, her freedom. She had spent so many years giving without asking for anything in return. But now, it was time to reap the rewards of her own effort. The deal would take her company global, opening doors she never imagined possible. For the first time, she felt the tangible result of her hard work and vision. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. Another call from Kathy. Margaret paused, her fingers hovering over the screen. The reflex to pick up was still there, a faint echo of the old Margaret who had always been available. But now, she didn't need to answer. She had already made her choice. She let the call go to voicemail. And then, just as quickly, another message popped up. Derek's name flashed across the screen, followed by another pleading message. "Margaret, we need to talk. This is destroying us. Please, don't let this be the end of our family." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't feel the weight of their words anymore. Their demands, their guilt, they no longer had the power to pull her back. She had made a life for herself. A life built on her own terms, and nothing, not even their voices, could take that from her. With a steady hand, she deleted the messages without hesitation. Her life was no longer about apologizing, about carrying others' burdens. It was about the choices she made for herself, the paths she was forging alone. It wasn't just about success in business, it was about success in living, in creating a life that reflected her worth and her vision. She returned her focus to the contract, her mind steady and clear. After a few moments, her pen hit the paper. With that simple motion, Margaret signed the deal that would push her business further than she had ever imagined. She leaned back in her chair, a smile curling at the corners of her lips. The world was wide open now, and she was walking toward it with nothing but confidence. Later that week, another envelope arrived. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Kathy's. For a moment, she hesitated before opening it. The letter was long, filled with apologies and explanations. Kathy spoke of regret, of how she had finally realized the damage she had caused. She apologized for everything, the guilt trips, the manipulation, the constant need for control. Margaret read the letter, but she didn't feel the old surge of guilt. It didn't bring back the familiar weight of responsibility. It was simply words on paper, and for the first time, they didn't hold the power they once did. She didn't need to respond. She didn't need to explain herself anymore. Her life was hers to shape, and she had already made her peace. Instead of writing back, Margaret set the letter aside. There was no more room for that past in her life. The future she was building was all hers, and nothing would distract her from it. A few days later, Margaret and Laurie sat at a table in a small cafe, the windows open to the spring air. The conversation flowed easily as it always did between the two of them. Lori had been with Margaret through it all, the hard decisions, the moments of doubt, the breakthroughs. She was more than a friend. She was a partner in this new life Margaret was living. "You did it, Margaret," Lori said, raising her glass in a quiet toast. "You've created the life you wanted, and you're just getting started." Margaret clinked her glass against Lori's, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "I never thought it would be possible. But here I am, and it feels right. All of it. For the first time, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." As they celebrated over their drinks, Margaret realized something else. She didn't need Kathy or Derek to validate her success. She had built this life on her own, with her own hands, and that was all that mattered. The world was out there, waiting, and Margaret was ready for whatever came next. The path ahead was clear now, brighter than ever. She was no longer defined by the past, by the people who had held her back. She was Margaret Thompson, a woman who had found her voice, her strength, and her future. And this was just the beginning. Margaret stood in the doorway of her office, the city sprawling out beneath her. The sun was high, casting a golden hue over the skyline. She was here, finally. The woman who had once been invisible, overwhelmed by the needs of others, now stood strong and confident in her own success. The business, her vision, was thriving. This was her world now, built from nothing but her own will and determination. Her phone buzzed on her desk, pulling her from her thoughts. Kathy. The name alone brought a familiar pang, but this time it didn't pull her in. Margaret had made her choice. She didn't need to engage, didn't need to apologize anymore. The reflex was there, to pick up, to explain, to make everything okay. But Margaret had learned, over time, that she couldn't keep sacrificing herself for others. Not anymore. She let the call go to voicemail. The message was brief, as expected. "You've ruined everything. You've walked away from your family. I need you, Mom. Please don't do this." Margaret read the words, but they didn't hurt anymore. The guilt that had once chained her to Kathy's needs had dissolved, replaced with a quiet strength. She didn't feel the need to respond, to fix anything. She had spent too many years trying to make Kathy happy, too many years trying to earn her approval. Now, Margaret was living for herself. She set the phone down without a second thought, the weight of their demands no longer pressing on her chest. There was nothing more to say. She had already made her peace with her choices. Margaret turned back to the papers on her desk, the new deal she had signed just days earlier staring back at her. This deal wasn't just financial success. It was a testament to everything she had accomplished on her own. A year ago, this moment would have felt like a distant dream. Now, it was her reality. Her business was flourishing, and her vision for empowering women in the workplace was gaining traction. The weight of guilt that had once defined her was gone. Margaret was free. Later that afternoon, Lori called. She didn't need to say much. Just hearing Lori's voice filled Margaret with warmth and pride. "Look at you, Margaret. You've made it. You built this life." Margaret smiled, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly. "I'm just glad to be here with you, for this moment." Lori's words echoed in Margaret's mind as she looked around the office. Her office. It wasn't just the walls or the desk or the contracts. It was the life she had created for herself. No longer defined by the needs of others, she had shaped her own destiny. Margaret's phone buzzed again, another message from Kathy. But this time, Margaret didn't even look. She didn't need to. As she stared out the window, the city below a reminder of all the possibilities ahead, Margaret knew one thing for sure. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The life she had built was hers, untouched, unapologetic, and all her own.